I'm Deirdre Delbert, and
I'm Eric Trudel.
And we're here from Bard College. We want to share with you a collaborative project we've been engaged in called the Bard Reading Initiative. And this morning has been incredibly inspiring to us, hearing about relationships as a kind of source of flourishing. So thinking of ourselves as cultivators, thinking of ourselves as people in relation with one another, parents and children, families, generations working together. And we're going to talk about the community that we're part of in Annandale, in Bard College, where we come together around the question of reading, which is ostensibly something, you know, we teach. We've all learned it, right, in elementary school and beyond. But what we're finding is that we have to approach reading in some new ways. And for those of you who teach and who expect students to be following you in reading practices, I think we've all come to a kind of a recognition that the way we read now, right, is changing. So that is our premise, and we're going to share a bit with you. This is about a sort of a report from our work together, and actually an invitation to all of you to share some of what you're finding about your practices as a reader and ecologies of attention. So.
And we should say that we're both scholars and teachers of literature. Deirdre is a Victorianist, but actually now she's burdened. She's the dean of the college, and so she's crushed under the weight of immense responsibility. And I'm just a French and literature teacher, so I just read and teach. Yeah. So over the last decade, at least, it's become a commonplace, I suppose, to proclaim the death of reading alongside the rise of social media, smartphones, and a culture of seemingly infinite distractibility. With the advent of AI, questions have intensified around the role of reading in relation to writing, to information literacy, and thinking itself. What does it mean to be a reader in a world saturated with image, networks, and notifications? What forms of attention do we employ in personal and social acts of reading? And how do we sustain this attention long enough in a context of hyperstimulation, long enough to give ourselves over to the experience of reading? Why is it that our students, who have grown up as digital natives, seem to falter when we expect them to concentrate on Plato's Republic, Ellison's Invisible Man, or, and here I'm being a little selfish, Marcel Proust's 3,000-page In Search of Lost Time? Is our alarm about the fate of reading and our capacity for attention justified, or is it merely a symptom of an overly nostalgic mindset? In other words, are we missing an opportunity, given the current situation, to re-examine how we think we read and how we think we ought to read? And what roles can colleges play in cultivating deep engagement with and reflection on evolving technologies of reading? How do we make time and how do we make space for reading?
So these are the questions that gave rise to the formation of the Bard Reading Initiative. We like to call ourselves BRI, and we've been meeting for about 7 years now. We had our first conference in April. So part of what we're going to share with you today is some of what we've learned in our conversations. These are faculty from the sciences, from the arts, from the humanities, and most importantly, students. Our students are critically important to this investigation, and we're really learning with and from students through some of the practices we're inviting them to enter into with us. What have we done over these last 7 years? We've invited numerous scholars who focus on questions of attention, on reading itself, and I want to give full credit to two of our honorary BRI members, Marianne Wolf. Some of you may know her work. She has a center at UCLA focusing on literacy and reading as a human right that should very much be factored into the way we teach now. And Naomi Barron, who just visited us in April and shared some important learnings and statistics with us about the state of reading today.
You want to talk about the other two, three, four?
Oh, we're also focusing on how we change our pedagogical practices. So that's one major area of investigation. We're creating new curriculum to showcase some of what we're learning about reading, and Eric will share a little bit of that. And then thirdly, we are working with students to create a culture of engagement and fostering a culture of reading that isn't primarily rooted in the classroom.
Right. So initially, what motivated us when we created BRI with several other faculty members, as Deirdre said, was a shared concern about our students' ability to read long literary or philosophical texts, or at the very least a concern about the quality and depth of their grasp during class discussion of texts that they claimed they had read carefully. To borrow in Catherine Ailes' distinction between the two key cognitive modes, it seems that our students' ever increasing capacity and inclination for hyper-attention, that is, switching focus rapidly between tasks, comes at the expense of the deep attention that is required in academia, that is, the focus on a single task for a long amount of time. The sense of a looming crisis of reading was admittedly based at first on anecdotal evidence in our classrooms and fueled, at least I'll speak for myself, by a recognition and a guilt about my own ability to focus and read, which is quite alarming when you think that, as scholars, teachers, and professional readers, that this ability was under threat. And I'm sure that I'm not the only one with friends and colleagues who are using the Freedom app or have bought those time logbox where you put your devices to try to free yourself for a few hours in order to do what you're supposed to be doing, which is reading and writing. The signs were also not only anecdotal, but all around us, and signs that this move from a digital culture or digital world to from a literal world to a digital world was not without consequence. And I'm thinking just of a recent piece in the New York Times, I think of 2 weeks ago, reporting that across the nation, states are confronting what they call a reading crisis and are having to take steps to increase reading instruction for an ever-growing number of struggling students. And so this is actually being recognized as a real problem across the nation at this point.
So when we're not hyperventilating in our catastrophic kind of mindset about this as humanists who are deeply engaged in reading and talking to people who've been reading, we have been sort of trying to think through this in ways that doesn't focus on simply a reading deficit or a kind of a problem, a kind of an illness that we have to somehow cure or a problem that has to be solved. Some of the facts that, for instance, Naomi Barron shared with us have grown out of international collaborations to see how are people reading today. So I'll give you just a couple of key indicators. In 2018, the Program for International Student Assessment showed that 50% of students reported reading only when required to do so. So no reading of any kind happening except when they are required to read in school. 92% of students also reported that it is much easier to concentrate when reading in print. But I think we all know that we're increasingly living in an educational system where there's a strong drive not to be reading in print, right? For all kinds of very good reasons. Research has also shown that if you're reading anything longer than 500 words, print is going to be better for retention and deeper comprehension. Whereas faculty surveyed believe that about 65% of their students did the reading for class. This is college level, not talking about high school. Students reported that between 20 and 28% of them do the reading. So when we're confronted with that kind of gaze of, well, opacity in our seminar classrooms, this may be part of what's happening. Finally, the National Survey of Student Engagement, NSSE, has reported that in 2019, first-year students in college spent no more than 6 hours a week on reading. So I'm not sure how exactly they are taking in the information, but it is not necessarily through reading. So these conversations and the kind of curricular and extracurricular focus that we're trying to develop at BARD, we hope will have some implications more broadly for certainly all of the institutions we interact with through things like the Open Society University Network and other institutions. And we hope all of you as well. Sherry Turkle, some of you may know her work. She's at MIT. She's kind of best known for a book called Alone Together, which is about what we expect from technology and some of the losses that we may be suffering right now through our relationships with it, writes that we need to move beyond a strict antagonism between print and digital, tradition and innovation, and understand the affordances of both. And so we want to be very clear that we are not some sort of Luddite group that is attempting to, deny the fact that we are very much living in a world where we all need to be able to read deeply across these mediums.
So we also want to hear from you, but we want to take a moment to describe some of the initiative we've had in the past, both curricular and extracurricular. And I'll start with the curricular innovation that we are not responsible for, but one of our cherished colleagues is. So in the spring of 2019, our colleague Phil Pardee, inspired by somebody called Justin McDaniels at Penn University, who teaches a class called Existential Despair, and also inspired by another colleague, Richard Miller, at Rutgers University, who teaches a class called Reading in Slow Motion. So Phil, inspired by those two examples, decided to offer a seminar called Poetry and Attentiveness. Phil is a poet, and he also a translator of poetry and a scholar of poetry. The class that he offered met every week for 7 hours. Let me say this again, 7 hours without interruption. No lunch, no anything, 7 hours.
No, and they ate.
And they ate, but it was part of the class. It's not like you go eat and you come back. They stayed together for 7 hours. And he did that, and here I'm simply quoting him. It was an invitation for students to practice, read, and write about their own ability to immerse themselves in what they read and what they experience, but also an invitation to consider their tendency, or our tendency, to get distracted, bored, or even angsty in the face of the great void, I suppose. At the beginning of every session, no surprise, all phones, laptops, and watches were turned in, locked away, and students committed to being offline for the duration of 7 hours. Now, again, it didn't mean that they were locked in the room. He did think about that for a moment, but they were not locked in the room. They did go, for instance, they went on walks in nature. Bard, we're blessed with a beautiful campus, and he reported, and this was both depressing and wonderful, that it came to some students as a revelation that you could actually walk in nature without a phone or without pods, listening to music, and just looking at nature, which is what he, well, we know this here, but apparently it came to news for some of them. And so the question was, how would students fare when asked to spend, for instance, 1 full hour on a short four-line poem, which is one of the assignments he did frequently. And student comments in course evaluations at the end of the semester are extraordinarily enthusiastic. To quote only 2 here, I'll quote the first one. The student says, "This was the most important class I took in college. This is the course Bard should advertise in every brochure. It was the epitome of what the liberal arts course is meant to do. It was challenging, thought-provoking, and ultimately life-changing. Everyone should take this class." And what's not to love? The second one, a second student wrote, "This is absolutely, without a doubt, the single most incredible, valuable, quite literally life-changing course I've taken at Bard. To call this a course feels like a disservice. It was more like a series of sabbat. I will never forget it." This is you now.
So to hear students talk about having an immersive experience that is like a Sabbath very much grows out of some of what Marianne Wolf's work is encouraging us to do, which is to think of creating reading sanctuary, creating a third space that isn't the space where the professor has created a syllabus and you as a student are reading, right, according to the design of that faculty member, and you're sort of receiving passively this kind, well, hopefully not passively, but receiving the text in this manner. We're interested in working with students to create this third space. And this space is something that's grown out of our reading groups that are created by students. They propose to us, this has been going on for 7 years, they propose to us a book they want to read. They create a group. All they have to do is write a one-page description of what they want. We buy everyone the book. We give them money to buy food so they can recreate the Phil party experience. And these groups have been tremendously successful. All we ask is that they meet 3 times during the semester and share with us what they've learned about their own reading process. It has been extraordinary. We have about 17 groups the very first semester come forward, and they're reading everything from Kierkegaard to Harry Potter to reading in Spanish, reading genre fiction, and it's a wonderful opportunity for students to begin to share the passion and the sense of attachment to reading they remember from childhood. One of the most heartbreaking things we can hear as educators is students saying to us, I've lost my love of reading. I don't remember what it was like when I was a little kid and I would get lost in a book. So part of our project is to bring them back to that original relationship to reading, and quite frankly for us also to rethink some of what we do as educators to share in that with them.
I should also add that the idea of creating those students group, when we did so in 2019, and it was obviously briefly interrupted, not so briefly, but sort of briefly interrupted by the pandemic. But the idea came from, we must credit one of our colleagues, a professor of Japanese, Nate Shockey. He was inspired by the culture of reading groups in Japan called Doku Shokai. And these are groups where all kind of people, children, factory workers, students, and teachers, retirees, came together to institutionalize communal reading. And so that's where the idea was to then try to replicate something along those lines on campus. In their proposal, when they applied for this support, and I should say that I don't think we've ever denied a group. We always said yes. In their proposal, students wrote that they were eager to take advantage of an opportunity to carve time out of their schedule to, I quote, read as much as they'd like. And although some groups simply wanted to share books they loved with one another, others wished to embrace texts and identities that were, in their view, too often left out of traditional curricula. And so, so we've talked about making time for reading. There was also an initiative to literally make space for reading, and this is again to try to think about a third space or reading sanctuary on campus. So I forget what semester, but it was a semester-long class that was offered on space making, where a group of students came together to design and build a space dedicated to reading on campus. This space now exists. We don't tell it to our colleagues too much because students serve fantastic espresso coffee, and if the faculty knew, we'd be doomed. And so it's a bit of a secret, but this beautiful space was built entirely by students under the guidance of a teacher over the course of a semester, and now that space is operational.
So we're very eager to continue in these collaborations with students. I want to be very clear, the students control this space. The students control the hours, they control the coffee, they designed all of the furniture and the setting, and they're very much driving for us our sense of what it is they want from reading, and they're giving us invaluable information. So I think we want to open this up to kind of hear what is happening with your relationship to reading right now. Certainly for us, it's made us much more self-aware, not least because when we teach courses such as Phil Party's Poetry and Attention, we do all the same things the students are doing. So that means we're carving out 7 hours of time in our lives to be reading with attentiveness. And we recognize that this is something that we're all facing at this cultural moment. And we want to find ways to reimagine reading. We wanted to just share one last word with you from Zadie Smith, the wonderful novelist who has really thought a lot about reading. She talks about how reading, we often think of it as a passive thing, or it's about resource extraction. We're taking tests to prove our reading comprehension skills. We're trying to demonstrate that there's a kind of sufficiently abstract level of capacity as readers. We hear a lot about how COVID has made us fall behind, right, in our reading skills as a nation. But at the same time, this is still an idea of reading that leaves out the kind of mysterious, transformative potential that people intuitively remember from their reading experience as children. It's a kind of, as Marianne Wolf put it, a kind of telepathy, where your mind is actually crossing over into the consciousness of another mind when you engage a text. And Zadie Smith talks about it as picking up a piece of writing, a score, that you as a musician could perform. Every time you open a book and read a book, you are performing that book. You are bringing that book to life. And only you, as the reader, can be having the experience you're having right now. So we want students to stop viewing this as something that we measure with metrics. We've already been talking about that as kind of an insufficient model for awareness and thriving and flourishing. And we're interested in creating a kind of phenomenology of reading with our students that we hope to share with others. So we would love to hear your thoughts and questions. So thank you very much.
Yes.
Yeah, so I have a question. I'll begin with an anecdote, and I think it'll make more sense. I was overhearing a conversation a while back, and someone said, you know, I just finished reading Crime and Punishment, and I was impressed. I was like, impressive. And then the next thing I heard was like, she said, yeah, I just listened to the last chapter in the car this morning on the way in. And me being me, I thought, dude, that's not reading, that's listening, that's different. So then I started thinking about, well, hang on a minute, what is the thing that's important here? Is it the dissemination of ideas? Or is it the act of looking at words on a page? Which then I started thinking, well, were there people in the 15th century, storytellers, moaning about the invention of the printing press, saying, oh, you know, we're all out of job now. We have an oral tradition which is dying out because everyone's reading books and nobody wants to tell stories anymore with hospitals. So, you know, and now we've got, in many places, the oral tradition's picking back up. People are telling stories again, listening to stories. So I'm curious to see your take on, is it important to actually look at the page and decipher and read the words? Or is it just the ideas, and is an audiobook as valuable, as valid a form of reading?
So I teach one of these reading initiative courses, and we talk all the time about this, the students and I. And my view is that we do all of the above. So I build exercises for the students where I ask them to read, and if they want to listen and reflect on how the reading informs their reading in print, right? If they listen to the tape, then what happens when they read? They're very sophisticated in their kind of translation back and forth. I also ask them to record their own readings. So the process of actually reading for someone else to read a passage from the novel we're reading together is incredibly creative for them. So I think it's absolutely something we need to move back and forth with and understand it helps people. And if it draws someone into a reading practice, in our view, I think it's very valuable.
No, and I agree, but I think that at the same time, every single one of those modes has a kind of a specific phenomenology that is, you know, that is important to it. So for instance, when Deirdre was mentioning that it's proven that in some modes of reading there's less retention, especially on screen as opposed to paper. I don't quite know when it comes to listening to books if this sustaining it. I mean, I only do it when I drive. It's much easier because I'm on long drives back to Montreal, and then I can listen to, not Proust, but close to that. And so but I don't know about that ability, if that ability is actually increased when you're in listening mode.
I would just say that, I mean, even in the 19th century, which is what I work on, collective reading aloud of Dickens and other kinds of texts was hugely important to enjoyment of the work. So I think the tension between individual private reading, that kind of very private experience, imaginary experience, and collective reading is something we want all of our students to be exploring. We just don't want to lose the book. Or
the capacity for attention, really. But okay, so we should really answer that. Thank you again.